Hello, Shane here from the Technical Marketing Engineering team. In this video, we are going to discuss deployment of Webex app in VDI, and we will look at the considerations for each media workload that you want to enable. So when we consider deployment of Webex app in VDI, we really need to consider the real-time workloads. Webex app brings together all collaboration workloads such as Webex Meetings, a calling service, be it Webex calling or Unified Communications Manager-based calling, and also the call on Webex service. When we deploy Webex app in VDI, we really need to consider how these services will function in a VDI environment. Essentially, what we're looking to achieve is we are looking to offload media termination to the local device, be it a thin client in the office or perhaps a home PC. So the rest of this session will focus on the Webex meetings, the Webex calling, the call on Webex, and the Unified Communications Manager based calling workloads in a VDI environment. So on the left here, we see a basic architecture diagram for deployment of Webex app in VDI. In the top, we have our virtual desktop. So this is typically part of your virtual farm. And on your virtual desktop, we deploy the Webex app for Windows. On the thin client or the home PC, seen at the bottom here, that's where we deploy our plugins. So our plugins are essentially responsible for media termination. So in a VDI environment, we want media to be terminated on the local device, the thin client or the home PC, and that's what the plugins are there to achieve. So as shown here in the diagram, we require two plugins. We have a Webex VDI plugin, which is responsible for offload of a Webex calling or Unified Communications Manager calling workload, as well as the call on Webex workload, which also includes space meetings. We also have the Webex Meetings plugin, which is responsible for offloading real-time media termination for a Webex Meetings session. So as of today, so this video is being recorded in January 2022, we do have a single installer for Windows and Mac based endpoints, which will install both the Webex VDI plugin and the Webex Meetings VDI plugin. So you can deploy one installer to your device and it will install both plugins for you. So just looking a bit further into what the supported deployments are. So when we're talking about VDI, Webex app can be deployed in multiple VDI type environments, including Citrix, VMware, or Azure Virtual Desktop. And then when we're talking about the endpoint, so this is once again the thin client or the home PC. So this is where we install the VDI plugins. We do support a number of operating systems and manufacturers for deployment of the VDI plugins. So we have a mixture of Windows and Linux-based supported endpoints as well as Mac. So for example, on the Windows side, you can deploy the single plugin installer, which will install both Webex VDI and Webex Meetings VDI plugins for you in a single installer. With Windows, we don't care about who the manufacturer of the device is. We simply support the Windows operating system. On the Linux side, we support open distros such as Ubuntu, for example. And then if you're working with a specific manufacturer, we support thin client vendors such as HP ThinPro, iGel, Elux. We also work with Dell Wise on their ThinOS deployment. And recently we have added support as well for macOS. So this means your users at home using maybe a macOS device or a Windows device can install the VDI plugins on their home device and then use that to optimize their Webex app in VDI deployment. So as I said, we are really considering here the real-time workloads and how deployment in VDI affects those workloads. So what we'll do now is we'll look at each workload and we'll look at the call flow for each specific workload. So we'll start with Webex meetings first. So in this diagram, it looks a bit different. On the left, we have our virtual desktop, or VDI with user one. And on our virtual desktop, we have the Webex app deployed. We also have our virtual desktop agent, whatever that may be. We also have our thin client. So this is our endpoint device, the device the user interacts with. So on the thin client device, we have the Webex Meetings VDI plugin deployed. We may have both plugins deployed. We may have both plugins installed individually, or we may have installed the bundled installer plugin, which installs both plugins. But in this scenario, we're considering the Webex Meetings VDI plugin. And we also have our VDI client installed in that machine, example, Citrix Workspace. So the standard sort of workflow here is a user would sit in front of their thin client device. They would launch their virtual desktop session. So typically this is via an app on the desktop or by browsing to their VDI controller and signing in. Once they launch their VDI session, we launch this virtual channel. So the dotted red line, and we're receiving our VDI desktop and we're sending mouse and keyboard events up. So this is standard VDI. Now, where does Webex come into the picture? So when the user launches the Webex app will always connect to our Webex service. And then, for example, let's say if a user launches a Webex meeting, so the user joins their PMR or clicks on a link in Outlook or clicks on the green button for one button to push, whatever it may be. They're joining a Webex meeting. So the meeting is set up from the Webex app in VDI. So Webex app will always establish its HTTPS-based connection to the Webex meeting service. And then once the user is in the meeting, all audio and video will be terminated on the thin client where the Webex Meetings VDI plugin resides. So what this means is the camera plugged into the thin client will capture video. The video will be encoded locally and sent to the Webex Meetings media service. Same thing for audio. The user's microphone plugged into their thin client device captures audio locally, it's encoded locally, and sent to the Webex Meetings service. In the other direction, the other participants are sending audio and video to the meeting service, and that audio and video is sent down to the Meetings VDI plugin. The video is decoded locally and it's displayed on screen, and the same way the audio is decoded locally and played through the speakers. So essentially what we're doing here is we're ensuring that all audio and video termination happens on the thin client device, so on the local device, and that we're not sending large amounts of audio and video inside this virtual channel to the virtual desktop, which would be a very inefficient use of our bandwidth. So what we're doing is we're using the Webex Meetings VDI plugin. This plugin is responsible for media termination, and we're ensuring that media is terminated locally and we're not routing media back to our data center. So that's the Webex Meetings workload. If we look at the next workload, which is Call on Webex. So this is the free basic calling service built into the Webex app. And this is also the service that is used for space meetings. So similar diagram once again, we have our Webex app in VDI. This time we have our Webex VDI plugin deployed on our thin client. So once again, the user is signed into their Webex app. We make a call on Webex call from the Webex app, or we join a space meeting, whatever the function is. The call is set up via a HTTPS session from Webex app in the virtual desktop to the Webex platform. And then once again, once the other party answers the call or once we join the space meeting, the Webex VDI plugin installed on the thin client device will be responsible for termination of media. So once again, all audio and video will be sent and received by the plugin installed on the thin client. So in this scenario, it's the Webex VDI plugin because we're talking about the call on Webex workload. But once again, we're not routing any audio or video through this virtual channel to the virtual desktop. All media termination is happening on the thin client device itself. So this is offloading audio and video termination, which ensures that all encode, decode, and rendering happens on the thin client, and that is the most efficient way to handle this media workload. So next we'll look at Webex calling. So this is an optional enablement for your organization. So if your organization wants to enable their users for Webex calling, this is the VDI model that you need to be concerned with. So slightly different diagram. We have our Webex app once again deployed in VDI in this gray box. So this is our virtual desktop or Windows virtual machine in the data center. And we have our user who's on their thin client and they have their Webex VDI plugin deployed. So user signs into their Webex app from their virtual desktop. Webex app will always create a HTTPS session to the Webex platform for sign in for other services. And when this user is enabled for Webex calling, Webex app will then have to register to the Webex calling service via SIP. So the SIP registration happens in the virtual desktop. So Webex app in the virtual desktop will register via SIP through the firewall to the Webex calling service. So this is a SIP registration, and an important point is the SIP registration happens where the Webex app is deployed, and that's always going to be deployed in the virtual desktop. So now let's look at what happens when a user makes a call or receives a call. So let's consider the user opens their Webex app, they select a contact from their contact list, or they punch in a number in their dial pad, or they receive a call via Webex calling. So the call is set up via the SIP session, and we want media termination to happen on the thin client device. So during this SIP session, Webex app will set its media address as that of the thin client where the Webex VDI plugin resides. So once the call is answered by the other party, it's the Webex VDI plugin that is responsible once again for termination of audio and video. So audio and video will be sent and received by the VDI plugin, sent up to the Webex calling service, and then sent to the other party, be the other party a desk phone registered to Webex calling, another Webex app user registered to Webex calling, or maybe even a PSTN gateway, for example. So there's no audio or video being sent inside this virtual channel to our data center. We're routing all audio and video from the VDI plugin on the thin client to the Webex calling service and then on to the other party. Next, we'll look at UCM calling. So this would be an alternative to Webex calling if you want to enable your Webex app users for Unified Communications Manager. So this scenario is slightly more complex because we are focusing on some on-premise infrastructure, Unified Communications Manager. So if we look at this diagram, let's consider everything in the gray box to be on the corporate network. So everything in the gray box is either on the corporate network or perhaps it's a VPN tunnel to the corporate network. Typically what this means is there's no firewalls or routers to traverse in this scenario. So if we look at the components here in the corporate network, we have our virtual desktop, and on the virtual desktop we have our Webex app deployed. We have our Unified Communications Manager in our corporate network. We have DNS, so this is corporate DNS, and on the DNS we have our SRV records for UCM discovery deployed. And we also have our thin client. So what's important in this scenario is the thin client is on the corporate network. So the thin client will have a direct path to Unified Communications Manager, to the on-premise DNS, etc. And once, of course, on our thin client, we have the Webex VDI plugin deployed. So breaking this down in a bit more detail, let's consider again the scenario. A user comes into the office, they sit on their thin client, or perhaps they're working from home, they sit in front of their device and they launch a VPN. So the thin client is on the corporate network in this scenario. So the user launches their VDI client, be it Citrix Workspace or whatever else it may be. That launches their virtual desktop session to their virtual desktop. So this display protocol. And once they are connected to their VDI session, they launch the Webex app. So the Webex app will connect to the Webex service, not shown in this diagram, but Webex app will connect to the Webex service in the cloud, will authenticate, we will download configuration, etc. So in this scenario, the user is enabled for UCM calling. So the Webex app will download the configuration that the user is enabled for UCM calling, and Webex app will also download the voice services domain from Control Hub. So the voice services domain defines how Webex app should discover Unified Communications Manager. So Webex app knows that it's running in a VDI environment based on its installation. So Webex app will then take that voice services domain and it will pass that on to the VDI agent on the machine, which is then passed down the virtual channel to the VDI client and then on to the Webex VDI plugin. So this is sort of an initialization for Webex VDI plugin, telling Webex VDI plugin, okay, we're about to connect to Unified Communications Manager for calling, but first of all, we need to discover where Unified Communications Manager is. So Webex VDI plugin takes the voice services domain and it will perform DNS SRV queries to the DNS. So in this scenario, it's an on-prem DNS because we're on the corporate network. So Webex VDI plugin will send the Cisco UDS SRV query and the Collab Edge SRV query to DNS based on the voice services domain. And because in this scenario we're on premise, we should receive a positive result for the Cisco UDS SRV query. So we should be returned an SQDN of Unified Communications Manager from DNS. So because we get a positive result for Cisco UDS, we know that we're on premise, and we also have the Communications Manager FQDN, which Webex VDI plugin passes back to the VDI client, back up the virtual channel to the agent, and then on to the Webex app. So the Webex app now has the address of a communications manager it should connect to. Webex app will then connect the communications manager. It will perform home cluster discovery, not shown here. Once we connect to our home cluster, we will then authenticate via HTTPS, not shown here. And then we will be provided with a SIP address to register to. And then the Webex app on VDI will perform a SIP registration. So this is important for anyone who maybe used Jabber VDI in the past. This is quite different. It's the Webex app in VDI which will perform the SIP registration direct to UCM. Okay, so Webex app will need to be able to connect to UCM on 5060 or 5061, whatever form of SIP you've enabled in your organization. So Webex app in VDI will perform the SIP registration to UCM. So once again, the user wants to make a call, so the user can make a UCM call via Webex app by their dial pad, by selecting a contact from their contact list, or perhaps it's receiving a call. So during the call setup via SIP, Webex app will set its media address in SDP as that of the PIN client, where the Webex VDI plugin is running. So Webex app is basically informing the other party during call setup that media termination will not happen on the VDI, it will actually happen on this PIN client. So once the call is set up and both parties answer, the Webex VDI plugin will then handle all audio and video termination. So we will have a point-to-point audio and video session to the other party. We're not sending any audio or video back up to our data center inside our virtual channel. We're handling all audio and video termination locally on the PIN client device. So in this scenario, the user 2 or the other party is a desk phone, but equally it could be a Webex app registered to UCM, or it could be a UCM PSTN gateway. Okay, so that scenario was UCM calling where the TIN client is on the corporate network. But what if your TIN client is not on the corporate network? What if it's a user working from home on their home PC or an organization provided TIN client, and that device is not connected via VPN, for example, back to the corporate network? So this scenario is slightly more complex. So our gray box this time is our corporate network. So everything inside the gray box is on our corporate network. We have our TIN client user, which is at home or roaming in another location. We have DNS, and the DNS is outside the corporate network. So this is public DNS. So this is DNS that's accessible from anywhere. And then also on our edge of our corporate network, we have a number of services. So we have our VDI access gateway, perhaps that's Citrix NetScaler or some other service, which is used to provide VDI access for remote endpoints. And we've also deployed Cisco mobile remote access. So we've deployed our Expressway C and Expressway E pair to allow remote SIP registration and also to allow remote endpoints to join a call. So let's consider this call flow. So once again, the user, likely at home, sits in front of their thin client device. They launch their VDI session, which will then launch this virtual desktop session from their thin client through their VDI access gateway to VDI. So that's standard remote access VDI. The user then launches the Webex app in their virtual desktop. Once again, Webex app will connect to Webex services via HTTPS, not shown here, authentication, download of configuration, etc. So Webex app, once again, will see that the user is enabled for UCM calling, and we will download the voice services domain from the Webex platform. Webex app knows it's in VDI, so it will pass the voice services domain via the VDI infrastructure to the Webex app VDI plugin. So the Webex VDI plugin now has the voice services domain, and we know we must perform service discovery for UCM. So we send our SRV queries, Cisco UDS and Collab Edge, to the DNS based on the voice services domain. And because this time we're connecting to a public DNS, we should get a positive result for the Collab Edge SRV query, which should in turn point to the FQDN of the Expressway E. So the FQDN of Expressway E is returned to the Webex VDI plugin. So the Webex VDI plugin now knows that it's outside the corporate network and we have the Expressway E address. So the Expressway E address is passed up the virtual channel once again to the Webex app. Now, the Webex app now knows that, okay, the thin client is remote, so we must perform a registration via Expressway. So even though the Webex app deployed in VDI may have a direct path to Communications Manager, because the thin client is outside the organization, the Webex app must register via the MRA deployment, so via Expressway E. So Webex app will then connect via SIP to the external address of the Expressway E. So in all likelihood, this will be connecting out through some router in your data center to the Expressway E external address, and then on to Unified Communications Manager for a SIP registration. One requirement here is that we have a source NAT between the virtual desktop, so between the IP address of the virtual desktop and the Expressway E external interface. We have a requirement that we have a source NAT between those addresses because we want to make the virtual desktop appear like it's running in a different IP address space than Communications Manager. Okay, so there must be a source NAT between the VDI and the Expressway E external interface. So the SIP registration happens from the Webex app in VDI back in through the Expressway infrastructure to UCM. So we're now SIP registered. If you look at your CSF device, for example, in Unified Communications Manager at this stage, you will see that the CSF device is registered from the IP address of Expressway C should be shown in this scenario. So now when we want to make a call or receive a call, once again, the user dials their dial pad or calls someone from their contact list or receives an incoming UCM call. So just like before, Webex app during the SIP session, during call setup, will set the media address in SDP as that of the thin client where the VDI plugin is installed. So once the other party answers the call, it's the Webex VDI plugin that will handle media termination. So all audio and video will be sent and received by the Webex VDI plugin. So in the case where the other party is on the corporate network, Webex VDI plugin will route media through Expressway E and C to the other party. So the other party could be a desk phone, it could be another Webex app user, it could be a PSTN gateway, it could be a conference resource. So when the thin client is outside and the other party is inside, media will be routed through the expressway infrastructure. Let's take a look at where both parties are outside the organization in a non-ICE-based deployment. So this is where perhaps the other user is working from home, or the other user is just some user who is not within the organization. So Webex app will route the audio and video via the C and back out to the other party, and media, audio and video will be received via the C and back out to the other party again. So what we're not doing here is we're not inserting raw audio and video inside our virtual channel, which would be really inefficient. We are offloading all audio and video termination to the local device, so to the thin client, and it's the Webex VDI plugin that's responsible for all audio and video termination. For more information, please take a look at the deployment guide for Webex app for VDI, which is available on cisco.com. And thank you for watching.